daily life and household duties of medieval peasant women. In medieval Europe, the daily life and household duties of peasant women were defined by the agricultural economy, social hierarchy, and family structure of the time. Peasant women played an essential role in maintaining the household and contributing to the survival of their families and communities. Their day typically began at sunrise and concluded at sunset, structured around seasonal agricultural work, domestic responsibilities, and care for children. Most peasant women lived in simple dwellings constructed of wattle and daub with thatched roofs, consisting of 1 or 2 rooms that served as both living and sleeping areas. The household included the immediate family, sometimes extended relatives, and in some cases, animals kept indoors for protection. Women were responsible for preparing meals, which required significant time and effort due to the lack of modern tools and amenities. Cooking was done over an open hearth using basic utensils, with meals consisting primarily of bread, pottage, vegetables, and occasionally dairy products or preserved meat. Women often participated in grinding grain, churning butter, and making cheese, which supplemented the family diet. They also engaged in the maintenance of clothing and textiles by spinning wool, weaving cloth, sewing garments, and mending worn items. In addition to domestic tasks, peasant women contributed to agricultural labor. They worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, assisting with sowing seeds, weeding crops, gathering produce, and tending to livestock. Their duties included collecting eggs, milking animals, feeding poultry, and caring for pigs, sheep, or goats. In some regions, women helped with market activities, selling surplus produce, dairy products, or woven goods to obtain household necessities. Childcare was a constant responsibility, with women overseeing the upbringing, health, and basic education of their children. Younger children stayed close to home, while older ones assisted with chores and fieldwork. Women's work extended beyond individual households, as they supported community events such as harvest gatherings, religious observances, and local fairs. They also provided care for the sick and elderly, utilizing basic herbal remedies and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Peasant women followed the religious practices of their communities, attending church services when possible and observing holy days and festivals. Their lives were influenced by the manorial system, where they and their families owed labor, produce, or rent to the local lord in exchange for access to land and protection. Legal rights for peasant women were limited, with most property and decision-making authority residing with male family members or feudal superiors. Marriage was a significant aspect of a woman's life, often arranged to secure alliances or economic stability. Upon marriage, women joined their husband's household and assumed full responsibility for domestic management. Widows sometimes managed households independently, though this was dependent on local customs and available resources. Despite their essential labor, peasant women held a subordinate position within the social order, with limited opportunities for upward mobility. Education for women was minimal, typically limited to practical skills required for household duties and survival. Literacy was rare among peasant women, though religious instruction sometimes provided basic familiarity with prayers or scripture. The agricultural calendar dictated much of their daily routine, with periods of intense labor during planting and harvest, followed by quieter times in winter. During winter months, tasks such as repairing tools, preserving food, spinning wool, and tending to livestock occupied their time. Seasonal variation also affected clothing, food availability, and daily activities. Women's work was physically demanding, often performed under harsh weather conditions with limited access to healthcare or leisure. Over time, minor changes in technology or agricultural practices influenced the nature of their duties, but the fundamental structure of peasant women's lives remained consistent throughout the medieval period. Their labor ensured the survival of their families and supported the broader rural economy, though historical records often underrepresent their contributions. Archaeological findings, legal documents, and ecclesiastical records provide indirect evidence of their roles and responsibilities. The lives of peasant women in medieval Europe were characterized by hard work, limited autonomy, and close integration with the agricultural and social systems of their communities. Their daily routine reflected the demands of subsistence living, the expectations of their households, and the constraints of their social status. The role of peasant women in medieval agricultural work. In medieval Europe, the role of peasant women in agricultural work was a fundamental part of rural life and essential to the subsistence economy that supported the majority of the population. Peasant women contributed to all stages of agricultural production alongside men, with their labor forming a critical component of both household survival and the broader manorial system. The majority of the population during the medieval period were peasants, many of whom lived and worked on land controlled by lords or monasteries under various forms of tenancy, including serfdom. Within this structure, peasant women were expected to participate fully in agricultural tasks while also managing domestic responsibilities. Their work in the fields was determined by the agricultural calendar, which included planting, tending, and harvesting crops, as well as maintaining livestock and processing agricultural products. During planting seasons, peasant women assisted with preparing fields, sowing seeds, and ensuring that crops such as wheat, barley, oats, rye, peas, and beans were properly cultivated. This work was labor-intensive and performed manually using basic tools such as hoes and wooden plows drawn by oxen. Weeding was another task assigned to women, as maintaining crop health required constant attention. Women were also involved in haymaking, which provided fodder for animals during the winter months. Harvest time was one of the most demanding periods of the year, with entire families, including women and older children, working together to gather grain, vegetables, and other produce. Women participated in reaping, binding sheaves, gleaning leftover grain from the fields, and transporting crops for storage. Their role extended to the processing of harvested products, including threshing grain to separate kernels from chaff, grinding grain into flour, and preserving surplus food for future use. In addition to crop-related work, peasant women were responsible for tending livestock, which formed an essential part of the rural economy. Women managed dairy production by milking cows, goats, or sheep and converting milk into butter and cheese. They collected eggs, cared for poultry, fed animals, and ensured the health of smaller livestock. In some areas, women assisted with the management of pigs, sheep, and other animals, contributing to the household's food supply and economic stability. Their work with animals often took place near the home, but some tasks required them to accompany herds to pastures or woodland areas. Peasant women also engaged in gathering resources from the surrounding environment. They collected firewood, herbs, berries, and other wild plants, which supplemented their diet and provided materials for household use. In regions where access to forests, rivers, or communal lands was available, women contributed to fishing, foraging, or other resource collection that supported their families. The division of labor within peasant households was influenced by the season, the type of crops grown, and the specific needs of the community. Though men were typically assigned heavier tasks, such as ploughing, women frequently performed comparable amounts of physical labor through planting, harvesting, and processing. Their work was vital in ensuring food security and maintaining agricultural production, especially in small-scale peasant economies where every household member's contribution was necessary. The manorial obligations of peasant families often required women to participate in labor owed to the lord, including working on domain lands, assisting with harvests, or fulfilling specific tasks such as spinning, weaving, or producing foodstuffs. Women's agricultural labor also extended to market activities when permitted, where they sold surplus produce, dairy products, or handmade goods to generate income or acquire necessities. The work of peasant women was generally unrecorded in official documents, though some historical sources such as manorial records, church documents, and legal codes indirectly reference their contributions. Archaeological evidence, such as tools, household items, and food remains, also provides insight into the agricultural roles of women. Despite their essential participation, peasant women held limited social and legal status, with most authority residing with male family members or feudal superiors. Their agricultural work, performed in addition to household duties and childcare, reflected the demands of subsistence living and the rural economy. Throughout the medieval period, the role of peasant women in agricultural labor remained consistent, shaped by economic necessity, seasonal cycles, and local customs. Their contributions ensured the continuity of food production, the maintenance of rural communities, and the survival of peasant households within the broader feudal system. Marriage, family, and childbearing for peasant women in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the lives of peasant women were shaped by the expectations of marriage, family, and childbearing, which were regarded as central aspects of their existence within rural society. Peasant women typically married at a young age, often between the ages of 12 and 16, as early marriage was considered essential for ensuring economic stability and the continuation of the family lineage. Marriage was rarely based on personal choice or romantic attachment. Instead, it was arranged by families to consolidate resources, secure land, and establish social alliances within the village or local community. The consent of the families, especially the male heads of households, held primary importance in the arrangement of marriage contracts, while the opinions of the young women involved were given limited consideration. Once married, peasant women assumed the role of managing domestic responsibilities alongside contributing to agricultural labor, which was essential to the survival of the household. Their duties included cooking, weaving, spinning, tending to livestock, maintaining vegetable gardens, and assisting in seasonal fieldwork such as harvesting or planting. Childbearing was regarded as both a duty and an expectation for married peasant women, as the continuation of the family line and the provision of future laborers for agricultural work were dependent upon the birth and survival of children. Peasant women often experienced multiple pregnancies throughout their reproductive years, though high infant mortality rates and maternal health risks were common. Medical knowledge was limited, and access to trained practitioners was rare in rural communities, leading to frequent complications during childbirth. Despite these challenges, women were expected to resume their household and agricultural tasks shortly after giving birth. Fertility was highly valued within peasant society, and women who bore many children were often considered to have fulfilled their social obligations, though they continued to face the physical strain associated with repeated pregnancies and demanding labor. Inheritance patterns among peasants were typically based on customary practices, with land and property passing primarily to male heirs, though women might receive movable goods or small portions of land as part of their dowries or as widows' entitlements. Widowed peasant women occasionally managed their households independently or remarried to maintain economic stability, especially if they had young children to support. Social norms dictated that unmarried women or those without children were viewed with suspicion or regarded as less socially valuable, given their deviation from the expected roles of wife and mother. The church played an influential role in regulating marriage and family life among peasants, promoting ideals of monogamy, fidelity, and procreation, though enforcement of these ideals varied in practice. Canon law recognized marriage as a sacrament, though formal church ceremonies were not always accessible or prioritized among rural populations due to logistical or financial constraints. Informal unions, betrothals, and community recognition of marital partnerships were sometimes considered sufficient for establishing legitimate families within peasant communities. Childbearing among peasant women was intertwined with religious and cultural beliefs, including the role of baptism in safeguarding infant souls and the invocation of saints or local traditions to ensure maternal and child health. Despite these practices, the realities of poverty, disease, and inadequate nutrition contributed to frequent hardships for peasant families. The division of labor within peasant households was structured around gendered expectations, with women responsible for domestic production and child rearing, while men typically engaged in heavier agricultural labor and represented the household in legal or communal matters. Nevertheless, women contributed significantly to the household economy, and their labor was indispensable to sustaining family livelihoods. Over time, regional variations and changing economic conditions influenced marriage patterns, family structures, and reproductive expectations for peasant women, though the fundamental reliance on their labor and fertility remained consistent across medieval rural society. While historical records concerning peasant women are limited, surviving legal documents, manorial records, and church accounts provide insights into their roles within family and community life. These records indicate that the lives of peasant women were largely governed by practical concerns related to survival, reproduction, and labor, with little emphasis placed on personal autonomy or social mobility. Peasant women's clothing and appearance, practicality over fashion. In the Middle Ages, the clothing and appearance of peasant women were primarily determined by functionality, availability of materials, and social expectations, rather than fashion or personal expression. Peasant women lived within strict economic limitations, which shaped every aspect of their daily lives, including how they dressed. Their garments were intended to be durable, practical, and suited to the physical demands of agricultural labor, household duties, and the harsh conditions of rural environments. Most peasant women wore clothing made from simple, coarse fabrics produced locally, with wool being the most common material due to its availability and affordability. Linen was also used, particularly for undergarments, though its production required greater labor and access to flax, making it less common for the poorest women. The garments themselves typically consisted of long-sleeved dresses or tunics that reached the ankles, providing modesty and protection from the elements. These dresses were usually made in plain colors, such as shades of brown, gray, or undyed natural tones, as bright dyes were expensive and often reserved for wealthier classes. When dyes were available to peasant communities, they tended to produce muted colors derived from plants, roots, or bark. Clothing designs were uniform and lacked decorative elements, as embroidery, embellishments, or complex tailoring were impractical and costly. The fit of peasant women's clothing was generally loose to allow for movement and accommodate layering during colder months. Women often layered their garments, wearing woolen overdresses or mantles during winter to provide insulation. Head coverings were a common aspect of peasant women's appearance, serving both practical and social purposes. Women frequently wore simple linen or woolen headscarves, veils or coifs to protect their hair from dirt while working, and to comply with social expectations regarding modesty. Married women were especially expected to cover their hair in public, as exposed hair was often associated with improper conduct or lower social standing. Footwear among peasant women was limited to basic leather shoes or wooden clogs when available, though many worked barefoot, especially during warmer seasons, due to the cost and wear of shoes. The upkeep of clothing was an ongoing task, with women responsible for washing, mending, and producing garments within the household. Most peasant women learned basic textile skills, including spinning wool, weaving cloth, and simple sewing, which were necessary for providing clothing for their families. Garments were worn repeatedly and repaired extensively to extend their use, as the production of new clothing required significant time and resources. Personal appearance for peasant women was shaped by necessity rather than preference. Hair was kept relatively short or braided to reduce entanglement during work, and personal grooming was minimal, focusing primarily on hygiene when possible. Bathing was infrequent due to limited access to clean water, though women might wash themselves and their clothing in nearby streams or communal washing areas. Jewelry and adornments were rare among peasant women, with occasional exceptions such as simple brooches, wooden beads, or small metal pins. Often inherited or gifted items with practical uses rather than aesthetic purposes. Social and legal regulations also influenced peasant women's clothing. Sumptuary laws, which restricted the wearing of certain fabrics, colors, or styles based on class, reinforced distinctions between the peasantry and higher social ranks. These laws ensured that peasant women's attire remained plain and utilitarian, preventing any outward display of wealth or status that did not align with their position in society. Seasonal changes dictated minor variations in dress, with heavier garments and cloaks worn during colder periods and lighter materials in summer, though the overall design and simplicity of clothing remained constant. The harsh realities of rural life meant that peasant women's appearance often reflected the physical strain of agricultural labor, with little opportunity for personal grooming beyond basic care. Historical records, illustrations, and archaeological findings provide evidence of these clothing practices, highlighting the consistent focus on practicality across medieval peasant communities. The appearance of peasant women in the Middle Ages cannot be separated from the economic and social conditions that defined their existence. Where clothing served the primary purposes of protection, modesty, and functionality, rather than personal expression or adherence to changing fashions, the hidden contributions of peasant women to the medieval economy. In the Middle Ages, peasant women played an essential yet often overlooked role in sustaining the economy of rural communities through a wide range of labor and domestic activities that contributed to agricultural production, household maintenance, and local trade. Although historical records frequently emphasize the economic contributions of men, the daily work performed by peasant women was indispensable to the functioning of the medieval economy. Their responsibilities extended beyond the home and were deeply integrated into the agricultural systems upon which medieval society depended. Peasant women participated in fieldwork alongside men, especially during labor-intensive periods such as planting and harvest seasons. They engaged in tasks such as weeding, collecting crops, gleaning leftover grain, and assisting in the preparation of produce for storage or sale. In addition to field labor, peasant women were responsible for tending to kitchen gardens, which provided essential foodstuffs such as vegetables and herbs that supplemented household diets and reduced dependence on purchased goods. Livestock care was another significant area of their work, including feeding animals, milking cows or goats, collecting eggs, and processing animal products like wool or dairy for household use or small-scale trade. Peasant women were also involved in essential domestic production that supported the broader economy. They spun wool, wove textiles, and produced garments, contributing to the clothing needs of their families and occasionally participating in the informal exchange of textile goods within the local community. The production of bread, cheese, and preserved foods by women ensured food security for their households, while surplus items were sometimes traded or sold in village markets. These activities, while largely conducted within or near the home, had economic significance by reducing household expenses and generating supplementary income. The work of peasant women extended to child rearing, healthcare, and basic education within the household, ensuring the well-being of future laborers and maintaining the social fabric of rural life. Peasant women also carried out tasks such as gathering firewood, fetching water, and repairing household items, which, though not directly reflected in economic records, were vital to maintaining living standards and supporting the labor capacity of family members. In some regions, peasant women participated in seasonal or occasional market activities, selling excess produce, dairy products, textiles, or small handmade goods to supplement household income. They sometimes bartered goods within the community, forming informal networks of exchange that contributed to local economic resilience. The contributions of peasant women were particularly evident in times of male absence due to military service, seasonal migration, or illness, when women assumed increased responsibility for agricultural and household management. Widows often managed land, negotiated rents, and fulfilled labor obligations to lords or landlords, demonstrating the capacity of peasant women to sustain economic functions independently when necessary. Despite their significant labor, peasant women's contributions were frequently undervalued or excluded from formal economic records, which focused primarily on land ownership, taxation, and male-dominated activities. Legal and social structures emphasized the authority of male household heads, limiting women's visibility in official documentation, though their work remained central to rural economic survival. The limited literacy rates among peasant women, combined with their exclusion from formal guilds or institutional economic roles, further contributed to the underrepresentation of their contributions in surviving historical sources. Nevertheless, archaeological evidence, manorial accounts, and observations from contemporary writers provide indirect insights into the scope of women's labor within the peasant economy. These sources indicate that women's work was essential to sustaining agricultural output, meeting household needs, and maintaining rural community stability across medieval Europe. The hidden contributions of peasant women to the medieval economy were characterized by their consistent involvement in both productive and reproductive labor, which supported not only their immediate households but also the broader agricultural systems upon which medieval society relied. Their activities, though often informal and unpaid, formed the foundation of rural economic life by ensuring the availability of food, clothing, and essential goods within peasant communities. This continuous and largely unrecognized labor reinforced the survival and functioning of medieval society. Despite the limited acknowledgement of women's roles in official economic narratives, childhood and coming of age for girls in medieval peasant communities. In medieval peasant communities, the childhood and coming of age for girls followed a predictable pattern defined by family expectations, labor demands, and social customs rather than individual development or personal milestones. From an early age, peasant girls were introduced to the routines and responsibilities that would shape their lives as future adult members of the household. Formal education was rare among the peasant population, and literacy was generally limited to members of the clergy or upper classes, meaning most girls in rural communities did not attend school. Instead, their upbringing focused on practical training within the home environment. From as young as 5 or 6 years old, girls were expected to assist with basic household tasks under the supervision of their mothers or other female relatives. These tasks included fetching water, gathering firewood, caring for younger siblings, and helping with food preparation. As they grew older, girls assumed more complex duties such as spinning wool, weaving cloth, tending to livestock, and cultivating garden plots that provided essential food for the household. Childhood for peasant girls was brief, as the transition to adult responsibilities began early and was largely dictated by physical maturity rather than chronological age. Cultural norms emphasized the importance of preparing girls for marriage and motherhood, which were regarded as their primary roles within the community. By their early teenage years, many girls were considered ready for marriage, particularly if they demonstrated the necessary skills to manage domestic responsibilities and contribute to agricultural work. Marriage often occurred between the ages of 12 and 16, though local customs and economic conditions influenced the specific timing. The process of coming of age was not marked by formal ceremonies or institutional recognition for most peasant girls. Instead, it was observed through practical milestones, such as assuming full household duties, participating in field work, or becoming engaged to marry. The onset of menstruation was sometimes regarded as a biological indicator of readiness for marriage and childbearing, though this was accompanied by continued labor expectations rather than any ritual acknowledgement. Social expectations reinforced clear gender roles within peasant communities, and girls were raised to adopt behaviors associated with modesty, obedience, and hard work. Failure to conform to these expectations could result in social disapproval or limited marriage prospects, which carried economic consequences for both the girl and her family. Religious instruction played a minor role in the upbringing of peasant girls, often conveyed informally through family members or local clergy rather than through organized schooling. Girls were taught basic prayers and religious observances, which reinforced the moral values and social norms of medieval rural society. Participation in church services or local religious festivals provided rare occasions for social interaction beyond the household, though such events were typically structured and closely supervised. Economic necessity often required peasant girls to contribute labor beyond their households, such as working in neighboring fields, assisting with seasonal harvests, or performing domestic work for wealthier families in the community. These experiences exposed girls to broader social networks and occasionally influenced marriage arrangements. Despite the demanding nature of their upbringing, peasant girls' experiences varied based on regional practices, family circumstances, and external factors such as crop failures or conflicts. Girls from slightly more prosperous peasant households may have had greater access to material resources, while those from poorer families faced heightened vulnerability to economic hardship and instability. The coming of age for peasant girls culminated in marriage, which marked the formal transition to adult status within the community. Upon marriage, girls assumed the full responsibilities of managing household tasks, contributing to agricultural production, and bearing children. Their social identity shifted from that of a daughter to that of a wife, and, eventually, a mother. The period of childhood for girls in medieval peasant communities was short, practical, and shaped by labor expectations rather than personal development. The patterns of upbringing reflected the economic realities of rural life, emphasizing survival, productivity, and conformity to established social roles. Girls were raised to fulfill the functions necessary for the maintenance of family livelihoods and the continuation of community structures under the conditions of medieval rural society. Peasant women's access to medicine and health practices in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, peasant women's access to medicine and health practices was shaped by limited resources, widespread poverty, and the prevailing medical knowledge of the time, which was often rudimentary and inconsistent. Formal medical care was largely inaccessible to the peasant population, as trained physicians typically resided in urban centers and primarily served the nobility, clergy, or wealthy merchants. The high cost of professional medical services further excluded most peasants, leaving rural communities to rely on local remedies, communal knowledge, and informal health practices for treating illness and injury. Peasant women played a central role in maintaining household health through the use of traditional remedies and practical care. They were responsible for tending to the sick within their families and villages, relying on knowledge passed down through generations rather than formal training. Herbal medicine formed the foundation of most peasant healthcare practices, with women cultivating or foraging for plants believed to have healing properties. Common herbs such as sage, rosemary, yarrow, and chamomile were used to treat a variety of ailments, including fevers, digestive problems, and minor wounds. Peasant women prepared simple remedies by boiling herbs into teas, applying poultices, or creating salves to soothe injuries. In addition to herbal treatments, basic hygiene practices were observed when possible, though access to clean water and proper sanitation was limited in rural areas. Bathing was infrequent due to the scarcity of water sources, and communal wells or streams often served multiple households for drinking, washing, and other needs. As a result, disease and infection were common, and outbreaks of illness could spread rapidly within peasant communities. Knowledge of health and medicine was closely tied to superstition, religious beliefs, and local customs. Peasant women often invoked prayers, charms, or folk rituals alongside practical treatments, reflecting the widespread belief that illness could be caused by spiritual or supernatural forces. The church influenced health practices by promoting the use of religious relics, pilgrimages, and prayers for healing, though these practices were combined with everyday remedies rather than seen as replacements. Midwifery was an important area of healthcare provided by peasant women, as childbirth occurred within the home, assisted by experienced local women rather than trained medical professionals. Midwives were responsible for guiding women through labor, addressing complications to the extent of their knowledge, and caring for newborns. Despite their experience, childbirth remained dangerous due to the lack of medical interventions, high risk of infection, and limited understanding of maternal health. Many women died during or shortly after childbirth, while infant mortality rates were also high. In times of serious illness or injury, peasant communities occasionally sought assistance from traveling healers, wise women, or individuals with reputations for medical knowledge. These practitioners provided herbal treatments, advice, or rudimentary procedures. though their effectiveness varied. Access to such individuals depended on availability, local acceptance, and the family's ability to provide payment, often in the form of food, labor, or goods, rather than money. Peasant women themselves often served as informal healers within their communities, gaining knowledge through experience and observation. Their roles as caregivers and health practitioners were essential to daily life, even though they held no formal status or recognition. Women's understanding of health extended to preventative measures such as maintaining food stores, preparing nourishing meals, and observing seasonal changes that affected sickness patterns. Nutrition played a critical role in health, but peasant diets were often poor, consisting mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetables. With limited access to meat or dairy, malnutrition contributed to weakened immunity and susceptibility to disease. Epidemics, including outbreaks of the plague, brought significant suffering to peasant communities with limited options for prevention or treatment. Quarantine measures were difficult to enforce, and medical understanding of contagious diseases was minimal. In such circumstances, peasant women continued to provide care with the resources available, relying on traditional remedies, religious faith, and community support. The health practices of peasant women in medieval Europe reflected the constraints of their environment, their dependence on local knowledge, and the central role they played in maintaining the well-being of their families and communities despite the absence of formal medical infrastructure. Religious beliefs and spiritual practices of medieval peasant women. In medieval Europe, the religious beliefs and spiritual practices of peasant women were shaped by the influence of the Catholic Church, local traditions, and the daily realities of rural life. Religion played a central role in the lives of peasant communities, providing a framework for understanding the world, explaining misfortune, and guiding moral behavior. Peasant women, like their male counterparts, were expected to observe the teachings of the Church and participate in religious practices, though their experiences were shaped by limited access to formal religious instruction and dependence on local clergy. Most peasant women were illiterate, and their understanding of religious doctrine came through oral traditions, participation in church services, and communal customs rather than personal study of religious texts. Attendance at Mass, participation in feast days, and observance of religious festivals were central aspects of spiritual life for peasant women. These events provided opportunities for collective worship, social interaction, and reinforcement of community identity. Religious festivals often coincided with agricultural cycles, integrating spiritual observance with the rhythms of work and seasonal change. Peasant women also engaged in private forms of devotion, including prayer, the use of religious symbols, and household altars. Simple crosses, images of saints, or relics were commonly kept in homes as sources of protection and spiritual comfort. The veneration of saints was widespread, with women frequently invoking saints associated with fertility, childbirth, and health. For many peasant women, spiritual practices extended beyond the formal teachings of the Church and included elements of folk belief and superstition. Local traditions, often rooted in pre-Christian customs, coexisted with Christian practices, reflecting a practical approach to religion that emphasized immediate concerns such as health, weather, and protection from misfortune. Peasant women sometimes participated in rituals intended to safeguard crops, livestock, and family members, blending religious and folk elements without strict separation between the two. The role of the Virgin Mary held particular significance for medieval peasant women, as she was regarded as a model of purity, motherhood, and compassion. Devotion to Mary provided a spiritual framework for understanding their roles as mothers and caretakers, and prayers to Mary were common among women seeking guidance or protection. The Church also influenced the moral expectations placed upon peasant women, promoting ideals of chastity, obedience, and humility. Women were taught to conform to these values through religious instruction delivered by clergy or reinforced by family and community norms. Failure to adhere to expected behavior could result in social disapproval or accusations of immorality. Participation in sacraments such as baptism, marriage, and confession formed part of the religious life of peasant women, though access to clergy varied depending on the location of villages and the availability of parish priests. Baptism was particularly important, as it was believed to cleanse original sin and ensure the salvation of infants. Women were responsible for ensuring the prompt baptism of their children, often within days of birth, reflecting both spiritual concerns and the high rates of infant mortality. Peasant women also took part in pilgrimages when circumstances permitted, traveling to local shrines or holy sites to seek healing, offer thanks, or fulfill religious vows. These journeys, though limited by economic constraints, were seen as acts of devotion and occasionally provided respite from daily labor. Despite their central role in spiritual practices, peasant women held no formal authority within the Church, as religious leadership was restricted to men. However, women occasionally served as informal spiritual guides within their communities, especially older women or those regarded as having knowledge of religious customs or healing practices. Religious life for peasant women was integrated with everyday experiences, offering structure, hope, and explanations for the hardships of rural existence. Illness, death, and misfortune were often understood through a spiritual lens, with prayers, rituals, and communal worship providing comfort and a sense of control. The religious beliefs and spiritual practices of medieval peasant women reflected a combination of formal Christian teachings, local customs, and practical concerns, shaping their understanding of the world and guiding their responses to the challenges of daily life within rural medieval society. Food preparation and the role of women in sustaining the medieval village. In medieval villages, food preparation and the role of women in sustaining daily life were essential components of rural survival and economic stability. Women were primarily responsible for the tasks associated with producing, preparing, and preserving food within the household, which contributed directly to the well-being of their families and the broader village community. The agricultural economy of medieval Europe was heavily dependent on subsistence farming, and food security was often uncertain due to factors such as crop failures, poor weather, and limited resources. Within this context, women's labor in food preparation was not only a domestic responsibility, but a necessary contribution to the village's ability to endure periods of scarcity. Most peasant households relied on staple foods such as bread, porridge, and simple vegetable stews to meet their nutritional needs. Women were tasked with grinding grain, baking bread, cooking meals, and managing household food supplies. Bread, in particular, was a central element of the diet, and its production required significant time and effort. Women used hand-operated querns or village mills to grind grain into flour, which was then mixed with water and sometimes other ingredients such as herbs or legumes before being baked. Baking was often done in communal ovens when available, as individual households did not always have the means to construct private ovens. In addition to bread making, women prepared meals using vegetables grown in household gardens, which provided essential sources of nutrition including onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans. These gardens were managed by women and were an important means of supplementing the family diet, especially during times when access to other food sources was limited. Women also collected edible plants, herbs, and berries from nearby forests or fields, contributing to the variety and nutritional value of daily meals. Animal husbandry provided additional food resources, with women playing a central role in caring for poultry, goats, and sometimes pigs. They collected eggs, milked goats, and processed dairy products such as butter and cheese, which were consumed within the household or occasionally sold or traded within the village. Preservation of food was an important aspect of sustaining the household, particularly during winter months or in preparation for poor harvests. Women used methods such as salting, drying, and fermenting to extend the shelf life of food products. These preservation practices required careful management of available resources and knowledge passed down through generations. In times of surplus, women contributed to informal village economies by exchanging or selling food products, reinforcing their role in sustaining not only their households, but the broader community. Feasts, religious festivals, and communal gatherings also required the preparation of large quantities of food, which women organized and managed with the assistance of family members and neighbors. Beyond direct food preparation, women's labor supported food production through agricultural tasks such as planting, weeding, harvesting, and processing crops. Their work in the fields, especially during peak seasons, was essential to ensuring that food supplies met the needs of the household and village. Women's knowledge of planting cycles, soil conditions, and crop storage complemented their responsibilities within the home, making them integral to every stage of food production and consumption. Despite their central role in sustaining the village through food-related labor, women's contributions were often regarded as extensions of domestic duty rather than recognized forms of economic activity. Formal records of agricultural production, taxation, or village management typically emphasized the roles of male household heads, overlooking the indispensable work performed by women in food preparation and household management. However, without women's efforts, food security and household survival in medieval villages would have been significantly compromised. Seasonal variations, regional differences, and household status influenced the specific tasks and resources available to women, but their responsibilities in food preparation remained a consistent and essential part of medieval rural life. Their knowledge, labor, and management of food resources formed the foundation of daily survival and contributed to the overall stability of the medieval village under conditions of frequent hardship and limited technological advancement. Legal rights and restrictions for peasant women in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the legal rights and restrictions for peasant women were defined by local customs, manorial obligations, and overarching social hierarchies that favored male authority and preserved traditional structures within rural communities. The legal status of peasant women was subordinate to that of men, and their rights were primarily exercised within the framework of the household under the supervision of fathers, husbands, or male relatives. Women's legal identity was often tied to their marital status, with unmarried women, married women, and widows subject to different rights and limitations. Unmarried peasant women, particularly those living under the authority of their fathers, had limited independent legal standing and were expected to conform to household expectations. Marriage transferred a woman's legal dependency from her father to her husband, reinforcing the male-headed household structure that dominated rural society. Married women held few autonomous legal rights, as their husbands were regarded as the primary representatives of the household in legal matters, including property transactions, dispute resolution, and contractual obligations. Nevertheless, peasant women could participate in certain legal activities, particularly in matters related to household management, land tenancy, or small-scale trade. In many cases, women managed portions of land, especially when their husbands were absent due to military service, seasonal work, or illness. Customary law in rural areas sometimes permitted women to inherit property, though inheritance practices favored male heirs and often restricted women's rights to movable goods, dowries, or specific household items rather than land. Dowries were an important legal and economic consideration in marriage, providing women with some security and resources, though the control of these assets often transferred to the husband upon marriage. Widows held comparatively greater legal rights, as they could manage household property, oversee agricultural production, and, in some cases, act as heads of households. Widows were often permitted to remain on their late husband's land or claim their dower rights, which included portions of property or resources allocated for their support. These rights were subject to local customs, and widows frequently faced economic challenges, social pressure to remarry, or limitations imposed by landlords. Legal restrictions extended to peasant women's participation in village governance, judicial proceedings, and economic contracts. Men typically represented households in manorial courts, village assemblies, and tax obligations, limiting women's direct engagement with formal legal structures. However, women could be involved in legal disputes concerning household boundaries, debts, or matters of personal conduct, especially when they directly impacted the family's welfare. Accusations related to morality, sexual conduct, or breaches of social norms disproportionately affected women, with penalties varying based on local customs and the severity of the offense. Women were subject to legal and social expectations regarding chastity, obedience, and marital fidelity. And violations of these expectations could lead to fines, public reprimand, or social exclusion. In cases of crime, women faced legal accountability, though their punishment was sometimes influenced by their social status, marital condition, or the nature of the offense. Property rights for peasant women were restricted, with land ownership and inheritance largely concentrated among male relatives or passed through male lineage. Nonetheless, women's work in maintaining agricultural productivity and household management indirectly supported the family's legal and economic standing within the community. Women also contributed to informal legal practices through witness testimony, participation in dispute resolution among neighbors, and involvement in religious or customary rituals that reinforced social order. Religious institutions played a role in shaping legal rights and restrictions, with church teachings influencing moral expectations and providing guidance on marriage, inheritance, and social behavior. The church often reinforced existing legal structures that prioritized male authority while offering limited protections for women, such as the recognition of dower rights or support for widows. Overall, the legal rights and restrictions for peasant women in the Middle Ages reflected the broader social framework of rural Europe, where gender, class, and custom determined individuals' roles, opportunities, and limitations. While some women navigated these structures to exercise limited legal authority within their households or communities, most were constrained by systems that favored male control of property, governance, and legal representation. How peasant women balanced domestic work and field labor. In medieval Europe, Peasant women were responsible for balancing domestic work and field labor as part of their daily contribution to the survival of the household and the wider village community. Their role in both the home and the fields was essential to sustaining agricultural production, maintaining household stability, and ensuring the well-being of family members. The division of labor in rural communities was structured around necessity rather than choice, and peasant women were expected to perform tasks in multiple areas simultaneously or in succession depending on the season, family needs, and local customs. Domestic work included food preparation, tending to children, maintaining household cleanliness, and managing essential resources such as firewood, water, and stored food supplies. Women prepared meals using basic ingredients such as bread, vegetables, and porridge, often supplemented by herbs or preserved food. They were responsible for grinding grain, baking bread, cooking stews, and preserving dairy products such as butter and cheese. These tasks were performed daily, requiring considerable time and physical effort. Alongside food preparation, peasant women tended to vegetable gardens and small livestock, including chickens, goats, or pigs, which provided additional food and resources for the household. Childcare was another constant responsibility, with women caring for infants and supervising young children while carrying out other domestic tasks. Older children were gradually introduced to household and field work under their mother's supervision. Peasant women were also required to contribute labor in the agricultural fields, especially during planting and harvest seasons, when all available members of the household worked to secure the food supply. Women participated in sowing crops, weeding fields, harvesting grain, and collecting produce. Their involvement in field labor varied depending on the size of the household, the availability of male labor, and regional agricultural practices, but it was a regular expectation for most peasant women. Balancing domestic work and field labor required careful organization of daily tasks, often with little separation between household responsibilities and agricultural duties. Women would perform domestic tasks in the early morning, move to field labor during the day, and return to household work in the evening. During busy agricultural periods, household routines were adjusted to prioritize essential field work, while other tasks were deferred or simplified. In households with small children, older relatives, neighbors, or older siblings often assisted with childcare to allow women to participate in field labor. The cooperation among family members and the wider village community was essential for managing labor demands, particularly during peak agricultural seasons. Peasant women's contribution to field labor was not limited to planting and harvesting, but included tasks such as gathering firewood, collecting fodder for animals, and processing harvested crops for storage. These activities required physical endurance and practical knowledge, which women acquired through daily experience and generational teaching. In addition to routine labor, women adapted to seasonal changes and unexpected challenges such as poor harvests, illness, or family emergencies. Their flexibility and ability to manage multiple responsibilities were crucial to household survival. Despite the demanding nature of their work, peasant women's contributions were often viewed as extensions of domestic duty rather than recognized forms of economic activity. Formal records of agricultural production or village governance rarely documented women's labor, though it remained essential to the functioning of rural communities. Women's ability to balance domestic work and field labor also depended on social status, household resources, and local customs. In some cases, slightly more prosperous households employed additional labor or shared tasks with extended family members, providing women with some relief from their workload. In poorer households, women faced increased burdens due to limited resources and fewer available laborers. Regardless of these variations, the expectation that women manage both domestic and agricultural work remained consistent across medieval peasant society. Their efforts in maintaining the household, producing food, raising children, and contributing to agricultural production ensured the survival and stability of rural communities under often harsh and unpredictable conditions. The balance between domestic work and field labor performed by peasant women was a reflection of the practical demands of medieval life, where survival depended on the continuous, coordinated efforts of all household members across multiple areas of responsibility. Education and literacy among medieval peasant women. Myth versus reality. In medieval Europe, education and literacy among peasant women were limited by social structure, economic constraints, and the practical demands of rural life. The widespread belief that all individuals during the Middle Ages were illiterate is an oversimplification, but the reality remains that literacy among peasant women was exceptionally rare. The formal education system, where literacy and learning were taught, was generally confined to monasteries, cathedral schools, and, later, urban institutions, all of which primarily served the clergy, nobility, and wealthy merchants. Peasant families, who lived in rural communities focused on subsistence agriculture, did not have access to these institutions, nor did they possess the financial resources to send their children to be educated. Social expectations also reinforced the division between education and manual labor, with learning considered unnecessary for the daily tasks that dominated peasant life. Peasant women were expected to perform domestic work, raise children, and contribute to agricultural labor, all of which required practical skills learned within the household rather than formal schooling. The myth that medieval women, including those from peasant backgrounds, frequently engaged in reading or writing is not supported by historical evidence. In reality, written records from the period indicate that literacy among peasant women was limited to rare exceptions, often involving women who lived near religious centers or who had indirect exposure to literate individuals. Religious knowledge among peasant women was primarily transmitted orally, through participation in church services, festivals, and community practices, rather than through reading religious texts themselves. The clergy often delivered sermons and moral instruction verbally, which allowed the general population to engage with religious teachings without requiring literacy. Prayer, songs, and religious stories were memorized and passed down within families, reinforcing spiritual knowledge through oral traditions. Some peasant women may have learned to recognize religious symbols, short phrases, or simple prayers, but this was the extent of literacy for most. There is limited evidence of individual peasant women possessing basic reading skills, typically in cases where families had connections to more educated individuals or where the woman had served in a household belonging to a wealthier class. Even in these instances, writing skills were almost non-existent among peasant women, as writing materials were expensive and writing itself was considered a specialized skill. Books and manuscripts were rare in rural communities, further limiting opportunities for literacy development. The few written documents produced at the village level, such as legal contracts, land records, or manorial accounts, were managed by scribes, stewards, or clerics, not by the peasant population themselves. Peasant women contributed to the transmission of knowledge through practical instruction in domestic tasks, agriculture, and family traditions, but this knowledge was based on observation and experience rather than formal education. Oral storytelling, songs, and local customs played a central role in preserving community knowledge, and women often served as key participants in maintaining these traditions. The reality of peasant women's education was shaped by the priorities of rural life, where survival depended on agricultural productivity, household management, and cooperation within the village. Literacy, in this context, was not considered essential, and the limited opportunities for education reflected broader social hierarchies that restricted access to learning based on class and gender. While literacy rates improved in later centuries with the spread of printing and educational reforms during the medieval period, peasant women remained largely excluded from these developments. The myth of widespread education among medieval peasant women often results from romanticized interpretations of history rather than direct evidence. The historical record shows that their knowledge was practical, transmitted orally, and focused on immediate family and community needs. In conclusion, education and literacy among medieval peasant women were rare, shaped by social, economic, and cultural factors that emphasized labor and oral tradition over formal learning. Their contributions to rural society were essential, but were grounded in practical skills and community knowledge rather than reading or writing. The prevailing reality was that literacy remained confined to small, privileged segments of the population, while peasant women fulfilled their roles through the transmission of knowledge that did not depend on formal education. Peasant women's social status, between oppression and independence. In medieval Europe, the social status of peasant women existed between the limitations imposed by social hierarchies and the necessary independence derived from their economic and domestic roles within rural communities. Peasant women were part of the lower class, bound to the land through obligations to landlords, subject to the authority of male relatives, and restricted by customary laws that defined their rights and responsibilities. Their status was shaped by the agricultural economy, family structure, and social expectations that emphasized obedience, labor, and conformity to established norms. Despite these restrictions, the practical demands of village life created circumstances in which peasant women exercised a degree of independence through their contributions to household management, food production, and community survival. Peasant women's social position was largely determined by their family connections and marital status. As daughters, they lived under the authority of their fathers, contributing to household labor and preparing for future roles as wives and mothers. Upon marriage, their legal and social identity became tied to their husbands, who were recognized as the heads of households and representatives in legal matters. Marriage arrangements were influenced by economic considerations such as land tenancy, dowries, and alliances within the community rather than personal choice. Women's opportunities for social mobility were limited, as their status was closely connected to their family's standing within the village, the amount of land they worked, and their household's economic stability. In this context, peasant women experienced forms of oppression rooted in legal inequality, restricted property rights, and exclusion from formal governance. Male dominance in village assemblies, manorial courts, and communal decision-making processes reinforced the subordinate position of women within both the household and the broader community. Customary laws prioritized male inheritance, limited women's control over land, and restricted their participation in official economic or legal affairs. Religious teachings reinforced these structures by promoting ideals of female obedience, chastity, and humility, presenting women's roles as subordinate to those of men. However, the economic realities of peasant life also created spaces for practical independence. As women played an essential role in sustaining households and contributing to agricultural production. Women were responsible for food preparation, tending to livestock, managing household resources, and assisting in fieldwork, particularly during planting and harvest seasons. Their labor was indispensable to household survival, and their knowledge of domestic management, food preservation, and practical healthcare positioned them as key figures within the daily functioning of the community. In some cases, women managed households independently, especially as widows or during periods of male absence due to seasonal labor, military service, or illness. Widows, in particular, held more visible forms of social independence, as they could inherit portions of land, oversee agricultural work, and engage in limited economic activities to support their families. While these circumstances did not eliminate the structural limitations imposed on women, they demonstrated that social status for peasant women involved both dependence and autonomy shaped by necessity. Community reliance on women's labor and expertise provided them with informal authority within the domestic sphere, though this authority was rarely acknowledged in formal social hierarchies. Women also maintained social networks through cooperation with neighbors, shared labor, and mutual assistance in tasks such as food production, childcare, and healthcare. These networks reinforced community bonds and provided informal support systems that contributed to women's resilience within a restrictive social structure. The dual realities of oppression and independence reflected the broader dynamics of medieval rural society, where survival depended on collective effort and practical competence, while social norms reinforced hierarchical distinctions based on gender and class. Peasant women's social status cannot be understood solely through legal definitions or formal rights, but must also account for their daily contributions, resource management, and adaptive roles within the community. While structural inequalities limited women's opportunities for personal advancement or formal authority, the essential nature of their labor and knowledge allowed them to exercise practical forms of independence within the constraints of their environment. How famine, war, and plague affected the lives of peasant women. In medieval Europe, the lives of peasant women were significantly affected by famine, war, and plague, which were recurring events that shaped the stability and survival of rural communities. These crises created economic hardship, increased physical demands, and altered social conditions in ways that compounded the challenges already faced by women in their daily responsibilities. Famine was a frequent occurrence due to poor harvests, unpredictable weather, and limited agricultural technology. When crops failed, food shortages resulted in malnutrition, illness, and increased mortality rates. Peasant women were responsible for managing household food supplies, which became especially difficult during periods of famine. They were required to stretch limited resources, prepare alternative foods using foraged plants or less desirable ingredients, and care for family members weakened by hunger. Malnutrition affected women directly, leading to declining health and reduced ability to perform essential domestic and agricultural labor. Pregnant and nursing women faced heightened risks, as food scarcity undermined maternal health and increased infant mortality. The psychological strain of famine also placed additional burdens on women. Though their concerns were addressed primarily through practical efforts to secure food, rather than through formal support systems, which were limited or non-existent in rural areas. War brought further disruption to the lives of peasant women, often resulting in physical danger, economic instability, and increased labor demands. Armed conflicts between kingdoms, nobles, or invading forces frequently targeted rural communities through raids, destruction of crops, or the conscription of male labor. When men were taken for military service or killed in conflict, women were left to manage households and agricultural tasks independently, assuming roles typically performed by male relatives. The absence of men altered household structures and increased women's workloads, though their authority remained informal and constrained by broader social norms. In areas affected by military campaigns, women faced additional dangers, including violence, displacement, and exploitation. Villages caught between opposing forces often experienced pillaging, forced requisition of supplies, and the destruction of homes or fields. These disruptions led to loss of resources, forced migration, and the collapse of local economies, leaving women to navigate survival with limited protection or external assistance. The presence of soldiers, both local and foreign, also increased the risk of assault, coercion, and social instability, though such events were rarely documented in formal records. War contributed to the breakdown of traditional community structures, placing further strain on women who were expected to maintain household functions in the absence of stability. Plague and disease outbreaks were among the most devastating events affecting peasant women, with the Black Death in the 14th century representing the most severe example. Plague epidemics led to high mortality rates, often killing large portions of village populations within a short period. Peasant women were responsible for caring for the sick within their households, a task that exposed them to infection and placed them at increased risk of illness and death. Limited medical knowledge, inadequate sanitation, and the absence of effective treatments contributed to the rapid spread of disease. Women performed nursing tasks, managed the dead, and attempted to maintain household stability as family members succumbed to illness. The high mortality associated with plague resulted in labor shortages, economic disruption, and significant changes to social structures. In the aftermath of such outbreaks, women occasionally experienced temporary shifts in their social or economic status, as labor shortages increased the demand for workers regardless of gender. Some women gained access to opportunities for land tenancy or wage labor that were previously restricted, though these changes were often short-lived and varied by region. Despite these occasional shifts, the overall impact of famine, war, and plague reinforced the vulnerability of peasant women, whose survival depended on managing household resources, providing care during crises, and performing essential labor under increasingly difficult circumstances. These recurring hardships shaped the daily lives of peasant women by intensifying existing challenges, increasing physical demands, and exposing them to heightened social and economic risks. The cumulative effect of famine, war, and plague reflected the precarious conditions of rural life, where women's responsibilities expanded in times of crisis, yet their formal rights and protections remained limited. Folk remedies and healing traditions practiced by peasant women. In medieval Europe, folk remedies and healing traditions practiced by peasant women were essential components of rural life, where access to trained medical professionals was rare and often limited to wealthy or urban populations. Peasant women relied on inherited knowledge, observation, and practical experience to address common illnesses, injuries, and health concerns within their households and communities. These remedies were based on the use of locally available plants, herbs, and natural materials combined with cultural beliefs and religious practices. Most peasant women learned healing traditions informally from older family members or through shared community knowledge. This knowledge included the identification, collection, and preparation of medicinal herbs, which were used to treat ailments such as fevers, digestive issues, wounds, and respiratory conditions. Commonly used plants included sage, yarrow, chamomile, nettles, and comfrey, each believed to possess specific properties beneficial to health. Women prepared infusions, teas, poultices, salves, and compresses using these ingredients, applying them to alleviate pain, reduce inflammation, or promote healing. In addition to plant-based remedies, healing practices often incorporated basic hygiene measures when possible, such as cleaning wounds with water or herbal washes to prevent infection. However, access to clean water and sanitary conditions was inconsistent, limiting the effectiveness of these efforts. Peasant women also employed folk remedies for conditions such as headaches, toothaches, and skin irritations, using materials like vinegar, honey, animal fats, or clay in their preparations. Healing traditions were not purely based on practical treatments, but were often intertwined with spiritual beliefs and superstitions. Illness was frequently attributed to supernatural causes, such as divine punishment, evil spirits, or curses, especially when conventional remedies failed to bring improvement. As a result, women combined physical treatments with spiritual practices, including prayers, charms, and protective rituals intended to ward off harmful influences. Religious symbols, such as crosses or saints' medals, were sometimes used alongside herbal remedies as part of the healing process. The veneration of saints, particularly those associated with healing, was common, and women prayed for the recovery of sick family members while administering remedies. Midwifery represented a significant area of healing tradition practiced by peasant women, as childbirth took place within the home under the care of experienced women rather than trained physicians. Midwives assisted in labor, managed complications to the extent of their knowledge, and provided care to both mothers and infants after delivery. They relied on a combination of herbal remedies, practical techniques, and spiritual practices to support women during childbirth, which remained a high-risk event due to limited medical understanding and the prevalence of infections. Peasant women also played a role in caring for the sick and elderly, using their knowledge of remedies to manage chronic conditions and age-related ailments. In times of widespread illness or epidemics, such as outbreaks of plague or other infectious diseases, their healing practices were often the only available form of care within the community. Though these remedies were based on traditional knowledge rather than scientific evidence, they reflected the practical necessity of addressing health concerns with the resources available. The reputation of women as healers varied within rural society. Some were respected for their skills and knowledge, while others faced suspicion or accusations of improper practices, particularly if treatments failed or if they were believed to possess harmful supernatural abilities. In certain cases, women regarded as healers were associated with witchcraft, reflecting the blurred line between accepted folk practices and feared magical influences. Despite these risks, the role of peasant women in providing health care through folk remedies remained an integral part of village life. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, contributing to the continuity of healing traditions even in the absence of formal medical institutions. The healing practices of peasant women in medieval Europe were shaped by necessity, resource availability, and cultural beliefs, providing essential care to families and communities in environments where professional medical assistance was largely inaccessible. Their work in this area formed a critical, though often overlooked, aspect of rural survival and health management during the medieval period. Festivals, leisure, and entertainment in the lives of peasant women. In medieval Europe, festivals, leisure, and entertainment provided limited but important opportunities for peasant women to experience relief from the continuous demands of domestic work and agricultural labor. The daily life of peasant women was structured around subsistence farming, household management, and caregiving responsibilities, leaving little time for personal leisure. However, communal festivals and occasional gatherings marked temporary interruptions in this routine and allowed women to engage in social and cultural activities within the village. Most festivals were tied to the agricultural calendar or religious observances, reflecting the close connection between rural life, the seasons, and spiritual traditions. Religious festivals such as Easter, Christmas, and saints' feast days were significant events in the lives of peasant communities, offering structured periods of rest, worship, and communal gatherings. During these occasions, peasant women participated in church services, processions, and public celebrations organized by local clergy or village leaders. Their involvement included preparing food, organizing household tasks in advance, and sometimes contributing to communal feasts by bringing bread, dairy products, or other goods. These festivals allowed women to spend time outside their homes, interact with neighbors, and engage in collective traditions. Seasonal festivals linked to planting or harvest periods also held social importance. Celebrations following the harvest provided a brief period of relief from agricultural labor and included communal meals, music, and dancing. Peasant women played a role in these events by preparing food, participating in dances, and observing cultural rituals associated with agricultural fertility or protection of crops. Although leisure time remained scarce, such events were recognized as valuable breaks from routine work. Entertainment for peasant women was limited in both variety and accessibility. Activities considered recreational were often incorporated into daily responsibilities or organized around religious and seasonal events. Storytelling, singing, and music formed common elements of village entertainment, with women participating alongside other community members. Songs were often passed down orally and contained themes related to rural life, work, and social customs. Women also engaged in simple games or activities during communal gatherings, though leisure remained secondary to work obligations. For most peasant women, leisure activities occurred within the domestic space and included practical tasks with social elements. Spinning, weaving, and other textile-related work were sometimes performed in groups, allowing women to talk, share stories, and exchange knowledge while completing household duties. These gatherings provided limited social interaction and contributed to the maintenance of community relationships. Weddings and other family celebrations were among the few occasions where peasant women experienced extended leisure and entertainment, though their involvement in organizing and preparing for such events remained labor-intensive. Marriage celebrations often included music, dancing, and communal meals, with women participating according to their family roles and social expectations. Public markets and fairs provided additional, though infrequent, opportunities for women to engage in leisure beyond their immediate household. At such events, women could purchase goods, exchange products, and observe performances such as puppet shows, musicians, or traveling entertainers. These occasions allowed women to encounter individuals from neighboring villages, contributing to social networks and limited cultural exchange. However, economic constraints and family responsibilities often restricted women's ability to fully participate in market activities. Social expectations regarding female behavior influenced the extent and nature of women's participation in festivals and entertainment. Modesty, obedience, and conformity to community norms were emphasized, and excessive displays of leisure or non-productive behavior were discouraged. Nonetheless, festivals and communal gatherings remained essential for reinforcing social bonds and providing temporary relief from labor demands. Despite their limited access to formal entertainment, peasant women found moments of social interaction and leisure through shared work, communal traditions, and occasional festivities tied to the agricultural and religious calendar. These experiences contributed to the maintenance of community cohesion and the transmission of cultural practices within rural villages. The role of peasant women in medieval craft and cottage industries. In medieval Europe, the role of peasant women in craft and cottage industries was an essential but often overlooked aspect of the rural economy. While the primary focus of peasant life centered on subsistence agriculture and household labor, many women contributed to small-scale craft production and domestic industries that provided additional goods for household use or local trade. These activities were generally carried out within the home or village and were closely tied to traditional domestic responsibilities rather than formal guild structures or urban workshops. Peasant women's participation in craft and cottage industries was shaped by necessity, resource availability, and local economic conditions. Textile production was one of the most common forms of craft work performed by women, with spinning, weaving, and sewing integrated into daily household routines. Wool from sheep and flax for linen were processed by women to produce cloth for clothing, bedding, and other domestic items. Spinning wool into thread, using a spindle or distaff, was a task performed by women of various ages, often during moments of relative rest or while supervising children. Weaving cloth on simple looms, sewing garments, and repairing textiles were also regular responsibilities. These activities supported the household's basic needs and occasionally produced surplus materials that could be exchanged or sold within the village. Peasant women also engaged in the production of dairy goods, preserved foods, and simple household items, which contributed to the cottage industry economy. Butter, cheese, and other preserved food products were prepared by women for household consumption and for local markets when conditions allowed. The production of these goods required knowledge of food preservation techniques, animal care, and seasonal management of resources. Women were responsible for collecting herbs, preparing medicinal remedies, and producing small handcrafted goods such as baskets, pottery, or simple tools, depending on regional materials and traditions. These items supported both household functionality and local economic exchange, though the scale of production remained small and informal. The term cottage industry reflects the localized, home-based nature of these economic activities, which were not formally organized through guilds or large workshops, but rather embedded within household labor. Women's contributions to these industries were often considered extensions of domestic duties rather than recognized economic work, even though they played a role in sustaining household income and village economies. In some cases, peasant women participated in the preparation of raw materials for broader markets, such as processing wool or flax for sale to merchants or artisans. While men were more likely to engage in external trade or market negotiations, women's labor in preparing materials was essential to these transactions. The division of labor between men and women varied by region, household structure, and economic necessity, but women consistently performed tasks that supported small-scale production and economic resilience. In households with limited land or resources, reliance on craft and cottage industries increased, with women's labor providing supplementary income or goods to compensate for agricultural shortfalls. Seasonal fluctuations in agricultural work influenced the availability of time for craft production, with women focusing on these activities during periods when field labor demands were lower. Despite the absence of formal recognition or documented wages, women's work in craft and cottage industries contributed to the household economy and provided necessary goods for daily survival. Their skills were transmitted through generations within families and communities, maintaining traditional knowledge of textile production, food preservation, and simple craftsmanship. Access to resources, such as wool, flax, or clay, depended on regional conditions and household status, with some women having greater opportunities to engage in cottage industries based on proximity to raw materials or local markets. Participation in these industries also allowed women to engage in limited social interaction beyond their immediate households, exchanging goods, knowledge, and labor within the village community. The role of peasant women in medieval craft and cottage industries reflects the integration of economic production with domestic responsibilities, highlighting the ways in which women contributed to rural economies through small-scale practical labor. Their work, though often informal and unrecorded, was essential to the sustainability of household livelihoods and the functioning of village communities within the constraints of medieval rural society. Widowhood and single life. Survival strategies for peasant women. In medieval Europe, widowhood and single life presented significant challenges for peasant women, requiring practical survival strategies to maintain household stability and meet basic needs. The social and economic structures of rural life were organized around family units and male authority, leaving women with limited formal rights or access to resources in the absence of a husband or male relative. Despite these constraints, widows and unmarried women developed methods to sustain themselves through labor, family support, and community networks. Widowhood was a common experience due to high mortality rates from disease, accidents, warfare, and other hardships that characterized medieval rural life. The death of a husband placed peasant women in a vulnerable position, as men were generally recognized as the legal representatives of the household and the primary holders of land or tenancy rights. However, customary laws and local practices often allowed widows to retain some rights to property, livestock, or land use, at least for a limited period. These rights were intended to provide basic security, especially for women with dependent children. Widows could continue to manage household affairs, oversee agricultural work, and fulfill obligations to landlords or village authorities. The ability to remain on the land and maintain household functions was essential for survival, though it was often contingent upon fulfilling labor responsibilities and paying rents or dues. In some cases, widows were encouraged to remarry to secure economic stability and maintain household productivity. Remarriage was common, especially for younger widows or those with children, as it restored the traditional household structure and reinforced community expectations. However, not all widows remarried, particularly older women or those with sufficient resources to manage independently. Widowhood, while challenging, could provide a degree of autonomy not typically available to married women, as widows sometimes exercised greater control over household decisions and resources. Single life for peasant women, particularly those who never married, was marked by social and economic disadvantages. Marriage was the expected norm, and unmarried women were often viewed as outsiders to the traditional household structure. Their survival strategies relied heavily on family connections, labor contributions, and, in some cases, service within other households. unmarried women frequently lived with relatives, assisting with domestic tasks, childcare, or agricultural labor in exchange for shelter and sustenance. In households lacking sufficient labor, unmarried women provided essential support, reinforcing their practical value despite their marginal social status. Some unmarried women engaged in cottage industries, producing textiles, food goods, or other items for local trade or household use. Their economic independence was limited, but these activities contributed to their survival and reduced reliance on extended family. In rare cases, unmarried women managed small plots of land or livestock, though access to such resources was restricted and often subject to approval by landlords or male relatives. Religious life offered an alternative path for some women, though this option was generally limited to wealthier families able to afford the costs associated with joining a convent. For most peasant women, the demands of rural labor and economic necessity defined their experiences of widowhood or single life, with little opportunity for personal advancement or significant social mobility. Community support networks played an important role in the survival of widows and unmarried women. Neighbors, extended family, and informal mutual aid provided assistance during times of hardship, illness, or labor shortages. Women often relied on reciprocal arrangements, exchanging goods, labor, or services within the village to meet basic needs. Older women with knowledge of healing practices, midwifery, or household management sometimes occupied respected positions within these networks, enhancing their ability to survive independently. Despite these strategies, the absence of male protection and legal authority exposed widows and unmarried women to greater economic insecurity and social marginalization. Their experiences reflected the broader constraints of medieval rural society, where survival depended on continuous labor, community cooperation, and adherence to established social roles. Widowhood and single life required peasant women to navigate these constraints through practical resource management, labor contributions, and reliance on social ties, ensuring their continued presence and participation within the village despite structural limitations. How religion shaped the expectations and realities for medieval peasant women. In medieval Europe, religion shaped the expectations and realities for peasant women by influencing social norms, defining gender roles, and providing a framework for understanding daily life, morality, and personal conduct. The Catholic Church played a central role in rural communities, and its teachings reached all levels of society, including the peasantry. For peasant women, religion established both ideals and obligations, while also offering limited avenues for spiritual participation and community involvement. The Church presented women as morally responsible for upholding virtues, such as modesty, obedience, chastity, and humility. These values were reinforced through sermons, religious festivals, and the everyday presence of the clergy in village life. Peasant women were expected to conform to these standards in their behavior, appearance, and interactions within the household and community. Marriage and motherhood were regarded as the primary roles for women, with the Church promoting these functions as part of the divine order. Women were taught that their primary purpose was to marry, bear children, and manage domestic responsibilities in accordance with religious principles. The ideal model for women was represented by the Virgin Mary, whose association with purity, motherhood, and devotion set the standard for female conduct. Religious instruction, often delivered by local priests or learned through family tradition, emphasized the importance of fulfilling these roles with obedience and diligence. Peasant women were also taught that suffering and hardship were part of the earthly life, with the promise of spiritual rewards in the afterlife for those who accepted their burdens faithfully. Church doctrine reinforced male authority within the household and the broader community. Husbands were considered the heads of families, with women subordinate to their decisions and leadership. Religious texts and teachings were used to justify this hierarchy, which shaped both legal and social structures. Despite these restrictions, religion also provided some forms of protection and recognition for women. The Church promoted the sanctity of marriage and the responsibility of husbands to care for their wives, while widows were afforded certain rights to property or household management under canon law. The sacraments of baptism, marriage, and burial were central to community life and included women in significant religious rituals. Peasant women participated in religious observances, including attending Mass, observing holy days, and joining in processions or festivals dedicated to saints. These occasions allowed women to engage in communal worship and reinforced their sense of belonging within the religious community. The veneration of female saints provided spiritual figures for women to emulate, and many peasant women prayed for divine assistance in matters of health, fertility, and household well-being. Religious festivals tied to the agricultural calendar also shaped women's routines, providing temporary breaks from labor and opportunities for social interaction. In addition to public observances, peasant women engaged in private religious practices such as prayer, maintaining household altars, and using religious symbols for protection and comfort. Their spiritual activities were integrated with daily tasks, blending religious beliefs with practical concerns related to family, health, and survival. Some women served informal roles within the religious life of the community by assisting with church upkeep, preparing for festivals, or supporting the clergy. However, opportunities for formal religious leadership or education were limited, as access to literacy and theological instruction was largely restricted to men and members of religious orders. Religious beliefs also intersected with folk traditions, with peasant women combining Christian practices with older customs, including the use of charms, blessings, and rituals intended to protect crops, livestock, and family members. While the Church sometimes condemned these practices as superstitious, they remained part of rural life, reflecting the practical application of religious faith in everyday matters. Religion shaped both the expectations and realities of peasant women's lives by defining their social roles, reinforcing gender hierarchies, and providing a framework for understanding their experiences. The Church's influence permeated household structures, labor practices, moral conduct, and community traditions, shaping how women navigated the demands of medieval rural society. Though largely excluded from formal religious authority, peasant women found ways to participate in and express their faith within the boundaries set by the Church and local customs. Peasant women versus noble women, comparing lives across the social divide. In medieval Europe, the lives of peasant women and noble women were defined by distinct social, economic, and cultural differences, shaped by their respective positions within the rigid social hierarchy of the time. While both groups of women faced limitations based on gender expectations, their daily experiences, responsibilities, and opportunities varied considerably due to their social status. Peasant women lived in rural communities, where survival depended on continuous labor in agriculture, domestic work, and food production. Their daily routines involved tasks such as cooking, cleaning, tending livestock, working in the fields, and caring for children. The economic contributions of peasant women were essential to the household and village, though their labor was rarely formally recognized beyond the domestic sphere. Peasant women had limited access to education, resources, or social mobility. Most were illiterate and learned necessary skills through observation and oral tradition. Their lives were structured around the demands of subsistence farming, family obligations, and seasonal agricultural cycles. Social expectations for peasant women emphasized obedience, hard work, and conformity to established gender roles. Marriage and motherhood were regarded as their primary functions, with arranged marriages based on family alliances and economic considerations. In contrast, noble women belonged to the landowning aristocracy and lived within castles, manors, or large estates. Their social status afforded them greater material comfort, reduced physical labor, and access to education, though their lives were still shaped by gender-based restrictions. Noble women received instruction in areas considered appropriate for their class, such as reading, writing, religious studies, embroidery, and courtly manners. They were also expected to manage large households, oversee servants, and represent their families in social and political affairs when necessary. Marriage for noble women was primarily a tool for securing alliances, consolidating wealth, and expanding influence. Marriages were arranged by families to serve political or economic interests, often with little consideration for personal choice. Noble women's roles included producing heirs, managing estates in their husband's absence, and maintaining the family's social standing. While noble women were excluded from formal political power, some exercised informal influence through family connections, patronage, or estate management. The experiences of noble women differed significantly from those of peasant women in terms of daily labor, living conditions, and access to resources. But both groups faced limitations tied to their gender. Noble women lived under strict social expectations regarding behavior, modesty, and obedience, similar to the moral expectations placed on peasant women. Both groups were subject to religious teachings that emphasized women's subordination to men, the importance of chastity, and the role of women as wives and mothers. Despite these shared expectations, the material realities of their lives were vastly different. Peasant women performed physically demanding labor, essential to the survival of their families, while noble women's labor was often administrative, social, or ceremonial in nature. Peasant women had limited autonomy, but widows or women in households with absent men sometimes managed land or resources on a small scale. Noble women, particularly widows or women of high status, occasionally held significant authority over estates, finances, and household affairs. Opportunities for social advancement were rare for both groups, though noble women could influence family status through strategic marriages, while peasant women's status remained tied to household labor and family circumstances. Access to healthcare and religious services also reflected the social divide. Noble women had greater access to physicians, midwives, and religious instruction, while peasant women relied on folk remedies, informal healthcare practices, and local clergy for spiritual guidance. Religious life shaped the experiences of both groups, but noble women were more likely to engage in patronage of religious institutions or participate in convent life if they did not marry. In contrast, peasant women's religious participation was centered on local churches, community festivals, and family observances. Despite these differences, the lives of both peasant women and noble women were shaped by societal structures that emphasized male authority, reinforced traditional gender roles, and limited personal freedom. The comparison between peasant women and noble women illustrates the influence of social class on daily life, responsibilities, and opportunities within medieval European society, highlighting both the divisions and shared constraints faced by women across the social hierarchy.